Tonight we'll look at Unit 5, what Strayer terms as the European moment. It's really a time period of global interaction, and there is a specialized area here that kind of comes about. Industry's been around for quite a while, but this takes a great step forward, and it's a major turning point in world history. Past this point of the Industrial Revolution, we're really in truly a modern world. Unit 4 was called the early modern world. I would think certainly we are now in the modern world for sure, and I think with the Industrial Revolution here, you'll start to see lots of modern world type issues and problems. Big populations, cause and effect on a grander scale, and we're going to see a widening and a continued widening even to today of people that have resources and have wealth and those who do not. We'll look at some of those things here as we go through this presentation on the notes. So we'll look at causes and consequences, causes and effects. Why does it take off in Great Britain? This is very interesting because it definitely could have happened anywhere, couldn't it? I mean, this great movement that happens and becomes this transformation really of the entire world. This could have taken place in China, certainly, right? Why not India? That's where the spice trade was, the Indian Ocean trade. Africa certainly had a lot of resources. We look at of Western Africa, they had a lot of gold, salt mines. They had iron works even early into last semester, the use of iron. And then you've got the United States, which is going to, which gained its independence here in the last chapter that we studied. It could have taken the lead on the Industrial Revolution, but it kind of follows in the footsteps of Great Britain. There's probably good political and social reasons for that as well, since they were sort of our colonizing force at the beginning here. But it takes off in Great Britain. Look at the positive and negative effects of that, and there certainly are a lot. We'll do a little bit of fun, historian type fun anyway, looking at the possibility of what would have happened if the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have occurred. What if it would have happened sooner, later? What if the steam engine would not have been created when it did? Pretty much everything still runs like the steam engine was first invented to run, and it's just been small little innovations potentially, but nothing big and forever changing. This internal combustion engine is basically the same thing. It's running on steam and getting power in very similar ways and burning fossil fuels. We'll also look at the 19th century industrial powers, how they're going to start to really exert a massive amount of force around the world. And Great Britain is your first industrialists, the first great industrialists, and first people that really get out there and start gathering those resources and putting them to use and selling them to world markets. But they're going to colonize the world, and we'll look at imperialism here, or at least the pieces to put that into place. Chapters 19 and 20 will really get into that quite a bit. The first big slide here, and I took a couple screenshots from the crash course on this because I think it's pretty interesting to look at. I mean, the first screenshot at the top there says, we've got 80% of people before the Industrial Revolution who are farmers, supporting all of the people, obviously, but everyone else that's specialized labor that we kind of got so excited about last fall. And we talked about, that civilization gives a chance to, move out of the hunting and gathering, Paleolithic type living and become more of a farming village. They were really still doing that all the way up to this point. Now, the bottom picture there is not the whole world, obviously, but it's the United States. We have so few. It's about 1% of Americans would consider their main source of income in their living to be farming. And That's pretty slim, but yet we're not hurting for food. So that's the other real interesting part here. At first, working conditions are severe and tragic in many cases. There are cases all throughout the early Industrial Revolution of child welfare and endangerment situations. So there's an early conflict between workers and industrialists and capitalists that, especially in the early days here, that there's this battle between the people who own the means of production. We'll start talking more about that in chapter 22 with socialism and communism. But how much power should the working force have? They certainly outnumber the people in charge and the owners of these companies. It's in a way, a small way, like the absolute monarchs were, like the church was, just the Catholic Church at one point, where you've got just a few people telling a lot of other people what to do. That to me sounds like if they're hungry, we're going to have another revolution, and we'll see some of those here in the second part of this chapter. Improved farming methods really paved the way for people to be able to move out of farms and into the cities and do this kind of work in factories. And at first, these are like 12-hour days, extremely difficult. We'll probably get a chance in class to look at some of the logs and some of the things written about the hours that people put in, their tea break and their dinner break, which was like lunch, and the fact that they went to work when it was dark and came home when it was dark. It's a pretty tough existence there for quite a while for a whole generation of people. But an increased food supply because of, and this is interesting, you know, and John Green talks about this some, and so does Andrew Marr to a degree, that there are these feedback loops where you are creating industry that allows people to move from the farm to an urban setting and work in factories to create more industry. And that industry is producing machines to give people the ability to make food with less hands doing the work on the farm, which puts more hands at work to create more industry. And you get the sense of understanding this now. It's no wonder, going back to this slide, that now, in the United States anyway, 1% of people call themselves farmers. I would think most of them are Aggies, like fighting farmers, Aggies, but maybe I'm wrong. Pretty good crash course. I think crash course is one of the first ones that they did was world history. And it really, I think John really starts hitting his stride right about here with the Industrial Revolution. He's only got like, this is 32, he's only got like 10 more left, but he really has it down at this point, I think. And some of these later ones are really well done, and this one is certainly one of my favorites. So if we get a chance, we'll see that in class, but it's unlikely just because we have so many other things going on. Now, last chapter, we had the revolutions, and this is something John mentions here, and I totally agree. It's correct in every way that these four revolutions are very, very important, but the one revolution, the Industrial Revolution, that is happening really at the same time, because you look at the date, 770 to 1840, and I don't know that 1840 is the best date for that, but because it continues on to the 1900s in some ways. There's second and third generations Industrial Revolution, if you think about it, where you move from the coal and steam powered generation of industrial capability to more of an electronic situation. And even today, you could think of it in terms of maybe we're still industrialized, certainly, but we're more moving at another stratosphere with the information age and computers and technology and things. But I think he makes a good point that maybe the most impactful of all these revolutions, even though I kind of like the French Revolution quite a lot because it's kind of interesting to study, and it is funny in some ways, it's tragic in others, but I think it's just so bizarre in so many ways. It's fun to study, but it kind of like doesn't work. It doesn't happen. Like the ideas are sparked to life, and they inspire revolutions across the world, and they still do. But it didn't. The French Revolution didn't stay intact, and in many ways, Napoleon, who took over in the coup d'état, was really just another king because he was more like a dictator. But these wheels of change that start to spin are a major impact. So what was distinctive about Britain that may have helped to explain this breakthrough status as the home of the Industrial Revolution? Let's check it out and think about it here. So this is just 300 years ago. So that's really hard to even like imagine that 300 years ago, at the beginning of this, people weren't living with much industry. This all sparks to life, and as I said earlier, probably the biggest change in world history that we've seen since the Neolithic Revolution, the advent of farming back in 10,000 BCE. So this is pretty remarkable that in some ways it took this long. I mean, did it take too long to get to industry? Do you think that maybe if the Chinese had been aggressive and not burned, the emperor didn't say after Zheng He had died, hey, let's burn the ships and let's pack up shop. We're not going to go out there. We're not going to do our power projection, and we're not going to do the tribute system, on the road anymore. And if people want things, they can come and get it from us. We're pretty self-sufficient. No, thank you. We don't need any of your kind here. Basically, what's that? What is that? What's the whole idea behind that? It's a conservative outlook. Certainly, you're not progressively going after things. You're letting people come to you, and they were self-sufficient in many ways. But it's also Confucianist, so there are strong Confucianist principles in there. The Europeans are nowhere near Confucius. I mean, they really have a strong tendency to believe that it's their power, the individual power and ingenuity and competition and driving to outdo somebody else that I think propels them to be the leaders of the Industrial Revolution. But certainly China could have done it. I don't think there's any question about it. And India and Japan in some respects are starting to industrialize in some small ways. It's sort of like, especially in India, they've got and they have had for quite a while, the textile industry. But it's not quite an industry. It's more like we've got a lot of people. We can put them to work. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's nowhere on the planet that just is all brimming and sparking to life like Europe. And there's no place like Great Britain that is capable of pulling off what they're doing with this. And in some ways, it's in some ways kind of egotistical and strong-willed to think that you and your little island here has the power to like really control the world, but they do it. If you watch the Olympics, the ones in London, just like I don't know, 4 years ago, I guess. I'm trying to remember. 2012 Olympics? I don't even remember. I'll have to look it up. But at the opening ceremonies were just this like huge industrial revolution. They had the smokestacks all piled up and stuff. We'll look at probably some pictures in class down the road here, but it's pretty interesting. So why is it Great Britain? Well, Andrew Marr really does a nice job of looking at that. And we'll watch a bit of this in class to introduce this revolutionary chapter on industry here this week. But his other series, which is how Britain made the modern world, that's really a pretty good series too. We'll look at parts of that down the road. But he really credits some of the more political decisions, maybe social structure decisions. We'll look at some of those in a minute here. But just kind of the way the patent system and was set up, that if you had an invention, you'd have it protected by the courts. There was, the legal ability to protect your interests if you were somebody who could create. And there's good and bad about that. Other parts of the world have had times of great technological and scientific flourishing. I think I tried to mention this before. The Chinese are right there at the top. This is 1313 AD. Obviously, it's just drawings of it. But they set up a simple system, water-driven at the bottom here. It's hard to see, but that's supposed to be water here that's driving this. And then this is going to create fire at the top, and it's a way to have a water wheel furnace. And what you're getting here is probably oxygen. It's fanning the flames as well. And they're probably smelting pots, or they're, you know, being able to make some type of metal in that way by melting it down. At the bottom, you see images there of Indian textile production, and it was done, you know, kind of painstakingly and individually but some of this, the hand quality of it was fantastic, and it was these types of products that Europeans and other people around the world wanted to get to. There's silk, many times made out of silk or cotton, and pretty fantastic ability for that economy to make that. But that's all they really had. And I think what the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain does is go off in many other directions, not just textiles. That's kind of the start, though. So Europe does not enjoy any overall big, huge economic advantage as late as 1750. There's nothing really about them that's super special, but the rapid spread of industrial techniques to much of the world in the past 250 years doesn't speak to why Great Britain would be the leaders in this either. So why did it start there? Well, there are some reasons that people have posited and put forth that are probably, I don't know, you could argue them. And that's one of the things I like about this question. I've had some students who've asked in the past, why does it begin in Great Britain, Mr. Duez? I mean, we talked about it, but I don't know that I really understand what the real reason is. That's part of what being a historian and a young historian is all about. You have to think for yourself, put together the information, and make your best argument or thesis as to why you think it did happen. And we're going to look at a lot of reasons why here. And that'll be the first part of this. Second part, we'll look at some other consequences of the Industrial Revolution. But are Europeans culturally superior to the rest of the world? You know, no. not in any way. I mean, we've studied that all year long. We know that they're kind of the backwater of the world. Maybe they're sparking to life here, and maybe it's driven by caffeine and tea and coffee and those kinds of things. And the salons and coffee houses and the scientific revolution and enlightenment that really does break with the traditional past and start to look at a new future in much more creative ways, in a scientific way, with a process that you will see for your own eyes and not just take the word of a king or a pope or someone in a church to tell you what they think it is. These are powerful and innovative ways to do things. So I think that has something to do with it. But I don't think all that's happening because they're somehow special creatures compared to the rest of the humans on the planet. That's certainly not the case, and I think most of my students can understand that as well. Are they freer politically and in having more individualism and innovation encouraged by those governments, and the strong property rights I talked about earlier, the copyrights, the patents, those types of things? Are those things going to be enough of a driving force to say Great Britain is the leader in this? Probably plays a role. How about, this is an interesting one, Europe's relatively very small population, which creates the need for inventors to do more with less workers. Some have said, well, this is falling on the heels of the plague. And some cities in Europe, they lost a half or sometimes 3/4 of their population in some port cities. Yeah, but not in Great Britain. I mean, Great Britain, some of the bigger cities had massive losses of life. This is also, you know, hundreds of years ago. So I think at this point, 1700, they're kind of catching up with the game, you'd think, and repopulating, and people are getting back after it. I don't think that goes far enough to explain how this could be just so explosive and take off. And the problem here with a lot of these situations, even the Scientific Revolution one, because you can argue that many of the ideas, these revolutionary ideas that Europeans came up with, were just taking the information and the work that they did in the golden age of the Islamic world and improving upon that, whether they knew that they were taking it or whether it was passed through them through good works. Who knows? But I think these all have limiting factors to them. And remember, Eurocentrism, it's kind of a main point that Strayer keeps making over and over, is this guilty conscience of, we're talking about Europe, so let's talk about why we should probably not be talking about Europe. because you want to look at world history in terms of a fuller picture. So why does it begin in Great Britain? Well, there's a couple interesting ideas here, and I like these ideas quite a lot, and this makes some sense. It's more of a global picture too. Coal is certainly in abundance in Great Britain, and that is a major force in the early days of the Industrial Revolution throughout. Really, today it still is. I mean, we're a coal-burning nation even today in the United States, and that's one of the reasons why we were ahead in the world for so long. But wages are relatively high in Great Britain. So this is some economic stuff here now. It's like voodoo magic, you know. Some of you guys get all like, what do I do? We're talking about math. Just relax, but think about this one. If you're paying people quite a lot of money, and it does have a relatively smaller population than, say, China and India, certainly. So wages are high. Energy resources are up. And you don't have a lot of people to do the work. So there is a whole lot of incentive then to not pay a lot of workers a lot of money and use that energy and have a machine use the energy to create the force and automated machines capable of doing work, like major work. And then people are kind of overseeing that and creating off of that, making a product off of that. India is the flip side of the coin. They don't have any coal, very little natural resources in that way to drive a machine. They have very low wages there. Even today, there's so many people too. I mean, they've got such a huge population, it's hard for most Americans to understand. So no coal, low wages, okay? Low coal, low wages, and a huge workforce. And it was the opposite in Great Britain. Bunches of coal, high wages, small working population. So it really is the opposite scenario. And so in India, that equates to really no need to automate. Why would you need to automate when industrialists or people who are controlling the textile mills could get that work done on the cheap anyway? And they had enough people to do the work. So, and they were pumping out work. It just, every person wasn't being maybe as productive as the folks in Great Britain would be with a smaller workforce and in a factory. Now, at the base level here, you're talking about textiles, that makes some sense, and that all works. When you start talking about creating like a locomotive and steam engines and trains and later the automobile and then electricity, that's going to blow the doors off what's going on in India. And I'm sure they're not seeing, and it's not really India yet, you know, they don't really call it that, it's smaller territories. And politically speaking, I don't think, and we talked about this in the last slide here, do they have political institutions set up to kind of, you know, foster an industrialized nation and protect the interests of industrialists and capitalists who are building buildings and making these machines? They don't really have that in India anyway. So let's look at some graphical information here. In 1700, India is the world's largest and main producer of cotton textiles, as I mentioned. And Indian textiles were exported to Britain on a pretty large scale. So they would be sailing there and bringing back, you know, what they needed. They bring back the raw cotton in many cases, and then turn it into some things in their like small, handicrafted ways. They had small, you know, they called it like home. It's kind of like a home cooked way of doing textiles. It's not in a big, huge factory, but people were still doing this. But in early 19th century, and you can kind of see the graphic here just take off. In the early 19th century, boom, Great Britain is just pulling away, and they're pulling away by a mile. Britain dominates the world markets and even starts to export to India. And this changes the game, and we'll later talk about the fact that Great Britain is in India, you know, and colonization that'll happen there. So again, why does it happen in Great Britain? You've got this cheap, amazing, productive Indian cotton created this very big demand in Great Britain for textiles. They like the textiles. We still do. I mean, some of you are fashionistas, I'm sure. You're like all into like the latest and greatest fashions, as I am. I mean, notice, you know, my t-shirt here. It's a big deal. which this spurs a need for agents of industry to create their own textile industries through the use of automated machines. So you want to meet the demand that's there for these products. That's what an industrialist does. That's what a capitalist would do, is say, how can I make money? What do people want to pay for? What do they want to buy? And can I make it for less than they want to pay for it? And that's simple, supply and demand. Can I supply that demand in a way that I can, enrich myself and create an industry? But India's people-powered and homespun version of this whole system very much inspires Britain to create an automated machine-driven approach to do the things that people started to want, and they had the wages to pay for it. So European Industrial Revolution is truly global in that sense, because it is impacted by these global factors, and that's just another example of what the modern world is like. Next, let's look here at the patterns of European internal development that favored innovation. This is a good one, and this is something that Andrew Marr talks about in his video clip. And you can click on that earlier and check that out. It's back here, right here. And he gets into this quite a lot about the way that Great Britain was administrated politically. The laws that were set up in a way to give people a chance to have a foundation of capitalism and industry to be created. European rulers had an unusual alliance with merchant classes, and we've talked about this before. Way back with northern Italy, the Medici family, who were merchants who really came to rule over Venice and other city-states that were very, very powerful and very, very wealthy. And their main objective was to enrich their city-state and then build these fantastic cities that were, again, competing with other little city-states and who has the most beautiful place to be and who has the most riches. So Europe is at the center of this, but Japan, India, China is developing market-based economies. Maybe not merchant class situations. Do the Chinese like merchants? Do they favor merchants? No, never. Even though merchants may be higher on the money scale and the social status scale, they're below peasants and farmers in China. So that's a big deal. Europe was at the center of the most varied exchange network thanks to their new finds in America. Of course, they're not going to America initially. They want to get to China and India and Southeast Asia. They want to get to the Indian Ocean trade, and they want to have the same, or quicker access to the textiles, the silks, the spices, all of that trade that is so very important to them. And they want to eliminate the middleman, who is the Islamic world at that time, who is the major trade, powerful trade nations on the earth. It's interesting because Europe is now set up in a way to favor merchants just like the Islamic world favored merchants. I mean, it's really part and parcel of the Islamic world. Contact with culturally different peoples encourages innovation, and I can see that point for sure. And the Americas, provide Europeans with silver, raw materials, new types of food, which again harkens back to my original point here that there was enough food being created by new means of agriculture and the Americas where Europeans could move off of the farm into the cities. Now, I'm not so sure that was a nice place to be in some ways. There are differing accounts on that because they were packed full of people in the early days. But you get the picture here that, again, I think there are these feedback loops where one thing feeds into another thing and you're chasing your tail trying to figure out, well, what's the cause? The cause is the effect, and the effect is making it more of a cause. It's pretty interesting when you look at it and start to analyze things. But say, for example, you're going to get a question on the AP test about this, and you could. What you need to do is pick an avenue to investigate, write your thesis on it, back it up, score your points, Do what you need to do. Think about world historical context on the CCOT. Think about point of view on the DBQ. Do all those kinds of things, but don't get paralyzed by all the choices that you could go with. If you understand what I'm saying, try to answer the prompt and understand that there is no real perfect answer to the prompt, if that makes any sense to you. You just have to back it up with evidence. And there are lots of ways you can go. And in this presentation, I've shown you dozens of ways that if, I got a question on that, I could sit down and say, I'm going to nail this thing. We're going to go down with, I think that it was the impact of the Americas, and that's maybe even more historical context on the CCOT, changing over time. And what stayed constant? The motivation for markets and silk and trade. Trade motivation stayed the same. Maybe it intensifies as they get, more and more. But that's another good thing to do on the CCOT. We'll talk about this in a week or so when we're reviewing it some more. But what stays the same over time? Confucianism can ebb and flow, but it's generally the same idea, right? European competition is propelling them forward. It's generally the same idea. It might be increasing and, exponentially increasing, but the same raw idea is pushing them forward. So when you're looking for continuity, maybe we're trying too hard and doing it in some ways that, we really don't need to, but look for like an overriding spirit of what a nation or people or time period was like. So when we come back in the next part of this video, part 2 of the video series on this, we'll look at these new middlemen of trade, the Europeans. Very competitive European nations now, and they're going to be supplied with the raw materials to set up some pretty impressive machinery, ships to keep sailing, gunboats to fire on people, and in essence, what they're really doing is all these little nations in Europe, and Great Britain's in the lead here, they're going to race for the resources to industrialize. Once they do get industrialized, what are they going to do with it? Well, unfortunately, they decide to go to war for much of the 20th century. So, again, we'll talk about that here in the next part, but keep plugging along. And we're Industrial Revolution. Heck, we're almost done with a year at this point. I mean, we're flying along. So, stick with me. We'll see you next time. And, as always, DFTBA.